On a bright spring morning in 1986, in a small California town where everyone knew their neighbors and children played freely in quiet streets, a young woman named Diana Martinez stepped out of her apartment to run errands and simply never came back. Her car was found 3 days later, parked at a rest stop 40 miles away, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, nothing visibly disturbed. No signs of struggle, no witnesses. No body, just an empty vehicle and a family suddenly trapped in the worst kind of uncertainty. For 37 years, the case remained frozen in time, a file gathering dust in the cold case archive of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Then in late 2023, a phone call changed everything. An arrest was made that would shock not just the small community where Diana had lived, but everyone who had known her, trusted someone close to her, and never suspected the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. What really happened on that April morning, and why did it take so long for the answer to surface? Riverside County in 1986 stretched across Southern California like a patchwork quilt of small towns, agricultural land, and growing suburban communities. The town of Norco sat nestled against the Santa Ana River, a place of tree-lined streets and modest single-story homes where families had lived for generations. The air carried the scent of citrus groves and horse ranches. Children rode bicycles without helmets. Neighbors left their doors unlocked. It was the kind of place where people believed bad things happened elsewhere, to other people, in other towns. Diana Martinez was 24 years old that spring. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office in Corona, a 15-minute drive from the apartment she shared with her roommate, Corinne Wells. Diana had moved to the area 2 years earlier from San Bernardino, drawn by a job opportunity and the promise of a fresh start after a difficult breakup. Those who knew her described a young woman with dark curly hair, an easy laugh, and a habit of wearing turquoise jewelry her grandmother had given her. She called her mother every Sunday evening without fail. She was saving money for nursing school. She kept a journal with a fabric cover decorated with small embroidered flowers. On the morning of April 12th, Diana woke at 6:30, same as always. Corinne heard the shower running, heard Diana moving around the small bathroom they shared, heard the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. Normal sounds, ordinary morning rhythms. Corinne was getting ready for her own job at a real estate office and barely looked up when Diana called out goodbye around 7:45. The door closed. The lock clicked. Diana's footsteps faded down the exterior stairs of their second-floor apartment. The parking lot was nearly empty at that hour. Diana's car, a 1982 Toyota Corolla in pale blue, sat in its usual spot under a pepper tree. She had complained the previous week that the car was making a strange rattling sound, but she had not yet taken it to a mechanic. She carried a canvas tote bag with her wallet, sunglasses, a grocery list, and the novel she was currently reading during lunch breaks. She wore jeans, a white cotton blouse, and the turquoise bracelet she almost never removed. According to the timeline investigators would later construct, Diana should have arrived at work by 8:20 at the latest. The dental office opened at 8:30. Dr. Richard Chen, her employer, noted that Diana was never late. She took pride in having the front desk organized, the coffee brewing, and the patient files ready before the first appointment. But that morning, 8:30 came and went. The phone rang unanswered. Dr. Chen, who had been reviewing x-rays in the back office, walked to the front and found the reception area empty, the lights still off, the door still locked from the outside. Clear's throat, he assumed Diana was sick and had forgotten to call. It happened. He called her apartment and got no answer. He unlocked the door himself, flipped on the lights, and started the coffee. The first patient arrived at 8:45 and seemed puzzled to find the doctor handling the check-in himself. By noon, Dr. Michel was worried. He called the apartment again. This time Karen answered. No, she said, Diana had left for work that morning, same as always. Karen felt the first flutter of concern but pushed it aside. Maybe Diana had car trouble. Maybe she had stopped somewhere. Karen called Diana's mother in San Bernardino just to check. Diana's mother, Rosa Martinez, had not heard from her daughter. Now the concern deepened into something sharper. Karen left work early and drove back to the apartment. Diana's car was not in the parking lot. She went inside and found Diana's bed made, breakfast dishes washed and placed in the drying rack, everything tidy and normal. Nothing seemed out of place except Diana herself, who was simply gone. By 4 in the afternoon, Karen called the Norco Police Department to file a missing person report. The officer who took the call was polite but not particularly alarmed. Adults were allowed to change their plans. Maybe she had decided to take a personal day. Maybe there was a family emergency. Give it 24 hours, the officer suggested. People usually turned up, but Diana did not turn up. Rosa Martinez drove to Norco that evening and sat in Diana's apartment, staring at her daughter's belongings as if they might offer answers. The turquoise necklace that matched the bracelet lay coiled on the dresser. Diana never went anywhere without wearing the full set. Rosa's hands shook as she picked it up. The next morning, Karen and Rosa went to the police station together. This time, their urgency cut through the bureaucratic calm. Officers began making calls. They contacted area hospitals. They checked arrest records. Nothing. By the afternoon of April 13th, a formal investigation opened. Officers visited the dental office, interviewed Dr. Chen, reviewed the timeline. They canvassed the apartment complex. A neighbor recalled seeing Diana walk to her car that morning. Nothing unusual. She had been alone. She had gotten into her car and driven away. Then, on the morning of April 15th, 3 days after Diana vanished, a highway patrol officer conducting a routine check of the rest stop along Interstate 15, about 40 miles southeast of Norco, noticed a blue Toyota Corolla parked in the far corner of the lot. The car had been there for at least 2 days, he realized. He had passed it during his previous shift. He ran the plates. The car belonged to Diana Martinez. Officers descended on the rest stop within the hour. They photographed the vehicle from every angle before approaching it. The doors were unlocked. The keys dangled from the ignition. Diana's purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside, her driver's license visible through the clear plastic window. Her sunglasses rested on the dashboard. The canvas tote bag lay in the backseat, grocery list still tucked inside. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no broken windows or damaged locks. The car looked as though Diana had simply parked it and walked away, intending to return in a few minutes. But there were anomalies. The odometer showed the car had been driven approximately 63 miles since Diana had last filled the tank, according to a receipt found in the glove compartment dated April 9th. The distance from her apartment to her workplace was 12 miles. The distance from her apartment to this rest stop was 41 miles. The math did not align with any reasonable version of events where Diana had been heading to work. Investigators interviewed every person who had stopped at the rest stop that day, tracking them down through credit card records from the gas station attached to the facility. No one remembered seeing a young woman matching Diana's description. The attendant who had been working the overnight shift recalled the blue Corolla appearing sometime in the early morning hours of April 13th, he thought, but he could not be certain. He had not seen who parked it. Search teams combed the area surrounding the rest stop. They walked through brush and desert scrub looking for any trace of Diana. Bloodhounds were brought in. The dogs picked up a scent near the car but lost it quickly in the parking lot, suggesting Diana had gotten into another vehicle. Back in Norco, investigators began building a picture of Diana's life, looking for anything that might explain her disappearance. They interviewed friends, co-workers, family members. Everyone described Diana as reliable, kind, without enemies. She was not involved in anything dangerous. She did not use certain substances. She was not seeing anyone romantically. The difficult breakup that had prompted her move from San Bernardino had been 2 years earlier, and that former partner had since moved to Oregon and had a solid verification for his whereabouts. But then a name kept surfacing in conversations: Thomas Hargrove. He was mentioned by Karen, by coworkers, by casual acquaintances. Thomas Hargrove was a friend of Diana's, someone she had met through a community college class the previous year. He was 32, worked as a maintenance supervisor at a warehouse, and lived alone in a rental house about 10 minutes from Diana's apartment. Several people mentioned that Thomas had seemed interested in Diana romantically, but Diana had told friends she valued his friendship and did not want to date him. She had been clear about that. Investigators spoke with Thomas on April 16th. He agreed to meet them at the police station. He arrived wearing work clothes, grease under his fingernails, his expression appropriately concerned. Thomas was a tall man with thinning brown hair and a quiet, careful way of speaking. He explained that yes, he knew Diana. They were friends. He had last seen her about a week earlier when they had met for coffee. He seemed genuinely distressed by her disappearance and offered to help in any way he could. Deputies asked about his whereabouts on April 12th. Thomas said he had been at work all day. His supervisor confirmed this. Thomas clocked in at 6 in the morning and clocked out at 3 in the afternoon. His time card was clean, but there was something about Thomas that made investigators pause. Detective Angela Ruiz, who conducted the interview, later wrote in her notes that Thomas maintained unsettling eye contact throughout the conversation, never looking away, never fidgeting. His hands resting calmly on the table. Most people, when nervous or upset, showed some physical tell. Thomas showed none. When asked directly if he had any idea what might have happened to Diana, he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care, that he hoped she was all right and that someone would find her soon. Those who knew him said Thomas had always been a loner. He did not have close friends. He did not attend social gatherings. He was polite but distant. Co-workers described him as competent at his job, but difficult to know. One woman who had worked with him for 3 years said she could not recall a single personal detail about his life outside of work. In the days following the discovery of Diana's car, the investigation expanded. Investigators checked financial records. Diana's bank account showed no unusual activity. Her last transaction had been at a grocery store on April 11th. They checked phone records. Diana had made no calls after 7:30 on the morning she disappeared. They reviewed missing person databases, looking for similar cases, any pattern that might offer a lead. Weeks passed. The media covered the story. Diana's photograph appeared in local newspapers, her mother pleading for information on the evening news. Tips came in, dozens of them, but none led anywhere substantial. Someone thought they had seen Diana at a bus station in Los Angeles. Another caller reported seeing a woman matching her description in Arizona. Every lead was investigated. Every lead went nowhere. The case grew cold not because investigators stopped caring, but because there was simply nowhere left to look. Diana had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Her car had been found, but Diana herself remained gone, and the question of what happened on that April morning hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Part 2. The investigation, the search operation in those early weeks was massive by the standards of a small department. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department coordinated with local police, highway patrol, and volunteer organizations. Teams spread out across a 50-mile radius from the rest stop where Diana's car had been found. They searched drainage culverts, abandoned buildings, remote areas where someone might conceal remains. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the desert. Divers checked reservoirs and irrigation canals. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers showed up by the hundreds, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, setting up a tip line. Rosa Martinez appeared at every search, walking through brush until her feet bled, calling her daughter's name until her voice gave out. Local churches held vigils. Businesses donated food and supplies for the searchers. Diana's face was everywhere, printed on posters taped to every storefront window, every telephone pole, every bulletin board. But as days became weeks and weeks became months, the energy dimmed. Volunteers went back to their regular lives. The media moved on to other stories. Only Rosa and Corinne and a few dedicated investigators kept pushing, kept asking questions, kept refusing to let Diana be forgotten. Detective Ruiz became the lead investigator, and she was the kind of officer who noticed details others missed. She went back through every interview, every statement, every timeline. She kept returning to Thomas Hargrove. His alibi was solid for the hours when Diana disappeared, but Detective Ruiz felt something was off. She drove the route from Diana's apartment to her workplace, then from the apartment to the rest stop, timing each journey, noting the traffic patterns, the stoplights, the possible detours. She calculated that if Diana had left her apartment at 7:45 and driven directly to the rest stop, she would have arrived around 8:30. But Thomas had been clocked in at work by 6 that morning. The timing did not work. If Thomas had been involved, he would have needed to act after his shift ended at 3 in the afternoon. But Diana's car had appeared at the rest stop sometime in the early morning hours of the 13th, at least 12 hours after Thomas got off work. Unless the timeline was wrong, unless the car had been moved later, unless there was a gap somewhere that had not been accounted for, Detective Ruiz interviewed Thomas a second time, then a third. Each time his story remained consistent. Each time his demeanor remained calm. He expressed sympathy for Diana's family. He said he wished he could help more. He mentioned that he had always cared about Diana, that he had hoped they might become closer, but he respected her boundaries. The way he said it made Detective Ruiz's skin prickle. There was something rehearsed about it, something too smooth. Clear's throat deputies whispered quietly among themselves that Thomas fit a certain profile. He lived alone. He had no close relationships. He had shown romantic interest in a woman who had rejected him. But profile was not evidence, and evidence was what they lacked. They had no body, no witnesses, no forensic findings that connected Thomas to any wrongdoing. His car, a 1979 Ford pickup truck, was searched with his consent. Nothing was found. His home was searched, again with his consent. Nothing. There were small inconsistencies, though. A coworker at the warehouse mentioned that Thomas had asked for time off on April 13th, the day after Diana vanished, saying he had a family emergency. But Thomas had no family in the area. His parents were deceased, and he had no siblings. When Detective Ruiz asked him about this, Thomas explained calmly that he had needed a personal day to handle some paperwork and had not wanted to give a long explanation to his supervisor. It was not illegal to take a day off work. Another detail emerged during the investigation. A clerk at a hardware store in Corona, about 20 miles from Norco, remembered Thomas purchasing a large tarp and several lengths of rope in early April, possibly around April 8th or 9th. The clerk remembered because Thomas had paid in cash for a fairly expensive purchase and had declined a receipt. When investigators asked Thomas about this, he said he had been doing some work on his truck and needed the supplies for hauling equipment. The tarp and rope were in his garage, he said, and he showed them to the officers. They appeared unused. Investigators checked the mileage on Thomas's truck. According to DMV records from his last registration, the truck had shown 42,000 miles in January. By the time investigators checked in May, it showed 43,000 miles. That was reasonable for several months of regular use. But the odometer was the kind that could be rolled back, and there was no way to verify the actual distance traveled. Physical evidence was scarce to the point of non-existence. Diana's car yielded no useful fingerprints beyond her own and Corinne's. No forensic traces of anyone else having been inside the vehicle. The keys in the ignition showed only Diana's fingerprints. The purse, the wallet, the tote bag, all untouched by anyone but Diana. If someone had moved the car, they had been extremely careful or extremely lucky. There was also the matter of Diana's behavior in the days before she disappeared. Friends mentioned that Diana had seemed slightly distant, maybe preoccupied. One coworker said Diana had mentioned feeling like someone had been watching her, but she had laughed it off, saying she was probably imagining things. Another friend recalled Diana saying that Thomas had been calling her more frequently, wanting to get together, and that she had been trying to gently create more distance without hurting his feelings. Corinne, the roommate, provided the most troubling detail. About 3 weeks before Diana disappeared, Corinne had come home to find Thomas standing outside their apartment door. He said he had stopped by to see if Diana was home, but Diana's car was not in the parking lot, and Corinne pointed this out. Thomas had seemed embarrassed, said he must have gotten the day confused and left. Corinne mentioned it to Diana later, and Diana had sighed and said Thomas sometimes had trouble understanding boundaries, but that he was harmless. Those words, "he was harmless," would haunt Corinne for years. As the investigation continued through the summer and into the fall of 1986, Detective Ruiz compiled a thick file on Thomas Hargrove. She had pages of notes, timelines, maps, interview transcripts. She believed Thomas was involved. She felt it in her bones. But belief was not proof, and without proof, without a body, without a witness, there was nothing to charge him with. By December 1986, the active investigation slowed to a near halt. The case was not officially closed, but resources were redirected to newer cases, cases where leads actually existed. Diana's file was moved to the Cold Case Division. Rosa Martinez continued to call the department every few weeks, asking if there was any news. Detective Ruiz always took her calls, always apologized for having nothing new to report, always promised that Diana had not been forgotten. Thomas Hargrove continued working at the warehouse. He continued living in his rental house. He went about his life as if nothing had happened, and perhaps, in his mind, nothing had. Those who watched him, the few officers who still kept informal tabs, noted that he never moved away, never changed jobs, never did anything that suggested guilt or flight. He simply existed, quietly, in the same small town where Diana had vanished. Years began to pass. Part 3. The silence. By 1990, 4 years after Diana disappeared, the case existed primarily in the memories of those who had loved her. Rosa Martinez had moved back to San Bernardino, unable to bear living so close to the place where her daughter had vanished. She kept Diana's room exactly as it had been, photographs on the dresser, clothes still hanging in the closet, as if Diana might walk through the door at any moment. Rosa aged rapidly in those years, her hair turning white, her face lined with grief that never softened. Corinne Wells had left Norco as well, relocating to Northern California for a fresh start. She had tried therapy, tried support groups, tried everything to shake the guilt that clung to her. She had been the last person to see Diana. She had heard the door close, heard Diana's footsteps fade away, and had not looked up, had not said anything more than a distracted goodbye. Those final, ordinary moments replayed in her mind constantly. What if she had walked outside with Diana? What if she had offered to drive her to work? What if she had noticed something, anything, that might have made a difference? For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have sensed something wrong but pushed the feeling aside, Karen understood that specific torment. She had mentioned to police that Thomas sometimes appeared at the apartment unannounced, but she had framed it as awkward rather than threatening. She had seen Diana gently maintaining distance from Thomas's affections, but she had not thought Diana was in danger, harmless. That word echoed. Thomas Hargrove continued his quiet life. He still worked at the warehouse, though he had been promoted to a higher position. He still lived alone. Coworkers who had known him for years still could not say they truly knew him. He attended work holiday parties but always left early. He never mentioned Diana Martinez, and after the first year, people stopped bringing her up around him. The case faded from daily conversation, becoming instead a local legend, a cautionary tale parents told their children about staying aware, staying safe. But there were small, revealing moments over the years, signs that perhaps not everything was as settled as it appeared. In 1993, a woman named Patricia Coleman began working at the same warehouse as Thomas. They struck up a friendship of sorts, mainly because Patricia was aggressively friendly and refused to accept Thomas's usual distance. She invited him to barbecues, asked about his weekends, pushed past his deflections with good humor. Patricia later told investigators that Thomas was odd but not frightening. He was meticulously organized, almost obsessive about it. His truck was always spotless. His work area was arranged with geometric precision. He became visibly uncomfortable if anything was out of place. Once, Patricia had borrowed a tool from his toolbox and returned it to a slightly different slot. Thomas had noticed immediately and without saying anything had moved the tool back to its correct position, his jaw tight. There were also the dreams. Patricia mentioned to a mutual coworker that Thomas had once confided, during a rare moment of openness, that he sometimes had nightmares. He did not elaborate on the content, but he said they had started years ago and never really stopped. The coworker had not thought much of it at the time. Everyone had nightmares occasionally. In 1997, 11 years after Diana vanished, Detective Ruiz retired from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. On her last day, she pulled Diana's file from the cold case archive and spent hours reading through it one final time. She had never stopped believing Thomas Hargrove was responsible. She had never found the proof. In her retirement speech, she mentioned Diana by name, saying that some cases stayed with you, that some victims deserved better than silence. She urged the department to never give up on Diana, but the case remained cold. New detectives came and went. The file was reviewed periodically, but no new leads emerged. Thomas Hargrove grew older, his hair turning gray, his face weathered. He still lived in Norco. He still worked. He existed in a kind of stasis, neither moving forward nor backward, just enduring. Rosa Martinez passed away in 2003, her heart giving out, her last words asking about her daughter. Karen Wells attended the funeral and stood at the grave long after everyone else had left, weeping for Diana, for Rosa, for all the answers that never came. For those who have noticed how time does not heal certain wounds, but simply teaches you to carry them differently, the families of the missing understand this truth better than most. The uncertainty is its own kind of torture. No body means no closure. No arrest means no justice, just an open wound that never quite closes. The years continued to pass. 2010, 2015, 2020. Diana's case was now one of hundreds of cold cases in the department's archives, periodically reviewed but never solved. Thomas Hargrove was now in his 60s, still living in the same rental house, still working in maintenance, still alone. And then in late 2022, something shifted. Part 4. The revelation. The call came into the Riverside County Sheriff's Department on November 3, 2022. The caller was a woman named Jennifer Parsons, and she sounded nervous, uncertain, but determined. She told the intake deputy that she had information about an old case, a disappearance from 1986. She had not come forward before because she had not been certain, but recent events had convinced her that what she knew mattered. Jennifer explained that she was Patricia Coleman's daughter. Patricia, the woman who had worked with Thomas Hargrove in the early 90s, had passed away the previous year. While going through her mother's belongings, Jennifer had found a small journal, really more of a diary, where Patricia had written personal reflections over the years. In one entry, dated March 1995, Patricia had written about a conversation with Thomas that had disturbed her. According to the journal, Thomas had been helping Patricia move some heavy equipment at work, and during a break, he had started talking about regret. He said that people did things they did not plan to do, that emotions could overwhelm logic, and that sometimes you had to live with consequences forever. Patricia had asked if he was talking about anything specific, and Thomas had looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Sometimes people disappear. And it's better for everyone if they stay gone." Patricia had written that the comment had chilled her, but Thomas had then laughed and changed the subject. And she had convinced herself she was reading too much into it. But the comment had stayed with her enough to write it down. Jennifer told the deputy that she had recently seen a news segment about cold cases being solved through new technology, and she had thought about her mother's journal entry. She did not know if it meant anything, but she felt she needed to report it. The information was passed to Detective Marcus Chen, a cold case specialist who had joined the department in 2018. Detective Chen pulled Diana Martinez's file and began reviewing it from the beginning. He read Detective Ruiz's notes, reviewed the original witness statements, studied the timeline. He noticed the same inconsistencies that had troubled Ruiz decades earlier. Detective Chen decided to take a fresh approach. He started by locating everyone who had been interviewed in 1986 who was still alive and reachable. Karen Wells agreed to speak with him. She was now in her 60s, living in Sacramento, and she broke down crying on the phone when Detective Chen identified himself and mentioned Diana's name. She said she had never stopped thinking about her friend, that Diana deserved justice. Detective Chen also contacted former co-workers of Thomas Hargrove, people who had worked with him over the years. Most had retired or moved on, but several agreed to speak with him. A pattern emerged in these conversations. Multiple people mentioned Thomas's rigid need for control, his discomfort with disorder, his strange comments about regret and consequences. One man recalled Thomas saying in the late 90s that people put too much effort into searching for the missing, that sometimes people left because they wanted to, and everyone should just accept it and move on. Clear's throat, but it was forensic technology that ultimately broke the case open. In 2023, Detective Chen decided to re-examine Diana's car, which had been stored in an evidence facility for decades. Advances in forensic science meant that traces of evidence too small to detect in 1986 might now be recoverable. The car was transported to a laboratory, and forensic technicians went over every inch of it using updated methods. They found something. On the driver's side door handle, on the interior, there was a partial fingerprint that had been too smudged to analyze in 1986. Using modern enhancement techniques, the technicians managed to lift a usable print. They ran it through databases. It matched Thomas Hargrove. Detective Chen felt his pulse quicken. A fingerprint on the interior door handle did not prove anything by itself. Thomas had admitted to being friends with Diana. He could have ridden in her car at some point. But Diana's friends had all said that Diana rarely gave rides to anyone, and Thomas had never mentioned being in her car during any of his interviews. Detective Chen decided it was time to speak with Thomas directly. On October 12, 2023, nearly 37 years after Diana vanished, Detective Chen and two other officers drove to the small house where Thomas still lived. They knocked on the door. Thomas answered, now 69 years old, his face deeply lined, his hair white. He looked at the badges and something flickered across his expression. Resignation, perhaps. Or recognition that this moment had always been inevitable. Detective Chen asked if Thomas would be willing to come to the station to answer some questions about Diana Martinez. Thomas stood in the doorway for a long moment, silent. Then he said quietly, "I've been waiting for this." At the station, Thomas waived his right to an attorney. He sat in the same interview room where he had been questioned decades earlier, his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. Detective Chen explained that new evidence had emerged, that they knew Thomas had been inside Diana's car. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he said, "I need to tell you something. I've been carrying this for 37 years. What followed was a confession that stunned even experienced investigators. Thomas described how he had been in love with Diana, how her rejection had felt like a physical wound, how he had convinced himself that if he could just talk to her one more time, make her understand how much he cared, she would change her mind. He said he had followed her on the morning of April 12th, intending only to talk. But when she had pulled into a gas station to fill up her tank, he had approached her, and she had been cold, frustrated, clear that she wanted him to leave her alone. Thomas said something inside him had snapped. He described it as a fog descending, emotions taking over, logic disappearing. He said he had convinced Diana to drive to the rest stop to talk privately, away from public view. She had driven in her car, he had followed in his truck. At the rest stop, the conversation had escalated. Diana had been firm, telling him she would report him for harassment if he did not stop. Thomas said he had grabbed her arm, she had pulled away, and in that moment he had made a choice he could never undo. He had ended Diana's life there in his truck with his hands. He said she had fought, but he was stronger. When it was over, he sat with her body for hours, trying to understand what he had done, trying to figure out how to live with it. Eventually, he had driven into the remote desert, far from any road, and buried her in a location he described in detail. He had returned to the rest stop in the early morning hours of April 13th, wiped down Diana's car as best he could, and left it there. He had gone home, showered, called in sick to work, and tried to act as if nothing had changed. Thomas spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, as if recounting someone else's story. He said he had thought about confessing many times over the years, but had never been able to bring himself to do it. He said he was tired now, that the weight of carrying the secret had become unbearable, that maybe telling the truth would finally let him sleep without nightmares. Detective Chen asked if Thomas could lead them to Diana's remains. Thomas nodded and said he could. On October 15th, 2023, a caravan of law enforcement vehicles followed Thomas Hargrove into the desert east of the rest stop. He directed them to a remote area, miles from the nearest paved road. He pointed to a spot near a cluster of Joshua trees and said, "There." Forensic anthropologists and search teams spent 3 days carefully excavating the site. On October 18th, they found human remains, buried shallow but preserved by the dry desert conditions. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were those of Diana Martinez. The arrest of Thomas Hargrove was formally announced on October 20th, 2023. He was charged with 1 count of homicide in the first degree. The news spread quickly through Norco and the surrounding communities. Those who had known Diana, those who had known Thomas, struggled to process the revelation. Many said they had always suspected. Others said they had never imagined. Some felt vindicated. Others felt horrified that someone they had worked alongside, spoken with, trusted in small ways, had carried such darkness for so long. Karen Wells heard the news from a reporter who called seeking comment. She sat down on her kitchen floor and cried, a complicated grief mixing relief and horror. Diana was gone. Diana had been gone for 37 years, but now there would be justice. Now there would be answers. Now Diana could be laid to rest properly. The media coverage was extensive. National outlets picked up the story. The details of the confession, the decades of silence, the cold case solved through a combination of old-fashioned detective work and modern forensics, captured public attention. Thomas's arraignment was held on November 1st, 2023. He entered a plea of guilty. He showed no emotion as the charges were read. During the sentencing hearing in February 2024, the prosecutor read a statement from Diana's family, written by a cousin who had been a child when Diana disappeared. The statement described the toll Diana's absence had taken, the way Rosa Martinez had died without knowing what happened to her daughter, the way an entire family had been trapped in uncertainty for decades. The statement ended with these words: Diana was loved. Diana mattered. Diana deserved better than to be buried in the desert and forgotten. We are grateful that she has finally been found, that her name has been restored, and that justice, though delayed, has been served. Thomas Hargrove was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a state facility where he will remain until his death. He is now 70 years old. His life, like Diana's, has been defined by a single morning in April 1986. Closing Diana Martinez was 24 years old when her life was taken from her. She wanted to be a nurse. She called her mother every Sunday. She wore turquoise jewelry and read novels during lunch breaks. She was a person with dreams and plans, and people who loved her. For 37 years, she lay in an unmarked grave in the desert while the man who put her there walked free, went to work, lived his life, and tried to forget. The case reminds us that justice can take decades but still arrive, that someone somewhere always knows what happened, that the weight of secrets can become unbearable, that families who wait deserve answers, that victims deserve to be remembered not just for how they were lost but for how they lived. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.